in all,
How do women and men differ? Is it on a cellular level?
yeah. So in the obvious ways, women are the ones who get pregnant, men are not. We are smaller and weaker than men, particularly on in terms of upper body strength. So the force that a woman can apply through a punch is about half as much as a
Hmm.
man, which is a lot, right? And this is why you see in elite athletics the difference between male and female athletes is huge. I do wonder whether the people, the progressives who are most in denial about the differences between men and women physically, I cannot help but suspect that they don't do a lot of sports. Because I think that if you participate,
Yeah.
particularly in strength-based sports or like martial arts or anything like that, it's going to become immediately apparent that men and women are profoundly different in this
Th-
dimension.
They're just hanging out with all the like spindly artist types.
Yeah, very indoorsy. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, um, so there's those which ought to be obvious to everyone. But there are also all sorts of really interesting ways, like women's immune systems are very different from men's. As we saw with COVID, men were more likely to die from COVID. And it was partly to do with things like men, certain lifestyle factors that might make a difference. But it was also just to do with our immune systems and the fact that we have to have immune systems which are able to accommodate the presence of an alien being and through pregnancy.
Hmm.
So it has to be different. Women are more prone therefore to having autoimmune diseases,
Hmm.
um, and
Much
more
more.
prone, yeah, more prone to things like, I don't know, osteoporosis. I mean, a host of things where you see massive sex differences. There's increasingly moves towards in pharmaceuticals, moves towards creating drugs that are actually have different formulations for men and for women because of the recognition that actually our systems are so profoundly different that it's not, we can't just consider women to be smaller men, which is normally what you do in dosing. You have to regard men and women as actually having some really fundamental differences, which mean that our drug interactions are different. And yes, this is happening exactly the same time that you have this like political discussion around whether or not women even exist as a category, or not just sort of gender goo.
Did you see the clip going around of it was somebody suggesting that the heartbeat at 6 weeks was manufactured by the patriarchy?
Yeah, I think I saw a little bit of that. American politician, was that right?
Yeah, that's where we're
Um,
at.
yeah, I mean that whether or not we want it to, sexual asymmetry is not going anywhere. And there has been such a reluctance among most feminists to grapple with it, particularly, I think I'd say particularly now, but it's a long-standing issue when it comes to the psychological differences between men and women, the differences above the neck. We some feminists, radical feminists in particular, are completely au fait with the differences below the neck, and will recognize the importance of things like strength differences. But the fact that there are average differences, but very apparent ones at the population level, is more difficult if what you're aspiring to is equality. And as I said at the top, if your interpretation of equality is women being more like men, the fact that there are these psychological differences that affect our behavior and our preferences is quite difficult to reconcile. So things like women are more agreeable than men are on average, women are more neurotic than men are on average, and the fact that our sexuality differences are very obvious at the population level. Yes, there are exceptions, but in general, men have more unrestricted sociosexuality. They're more interested in having casual sex, in watching porn, in buying sex. Men are much more likely to have paraphilias or fetishes than women are, much more likely, with a few notable and interesting exceptions. So, for instance, women are more likely to be masochists and so on. But in all other paraphilias, men are wildly in the lead. And these are all things that have become much more socially acceptable post-sexual revolution. All preferences that are much more likely to be found in men than they are in women. And something like porn or prostitution or casual sex, not only are men more likely to be interested in these things, but they also depend on women in order to enjoy them, right? Which therefore places demands on women. I think that what we basically have seen post-sexual revolution is if you understand two bell curves for men and women along the sociosexuality scale, it's not a conspiracy. This isn't to do with some exceptions. This isn't generally to do with men putting sort of interpersonal pressure on women. It's got more to do with culture and a new incentive structure post pill. but what you're basically seeing is the bell curve sort of trying to be dragged upwards towards the male end, and women being encouraged to behave more like men in every possible way. And I think in a lot of cases it's making women miserable, which is why I wrote the book. It's making a lot of men miserable too. I'd say the only group who have really profited from this change in sexual culture are very high status men.
What about very disagreeable, intelligent women?
I'd say in the workplace, absolutely. In terms of sexuality, I mean, there are women who are very high or very unrestricted sociosexuality, I should say properly, are genuinely do enjoy casual sex, genuinely do want to watch porn, genuinely are interested in all kinds of sexual adventure and experimentation. Those women do absolutely exist, but they are rare.
Yeah.
And they will always suffer from the risks associated with casual sex, like the risk of unwanted pregnancy, the fact that women being smaller and weaker means that in any encounter between a man and a woman on their own, the woman is almost always going to be much more physically at risk of violence. You know, most men can kill most women with their bare hands, but not vice versa. So even a woman who genuinely really loves casual sex, genuinely is really, really driven to have as many partners as possible, aside from any cultural pressure put on her, she's always going to run a risk in any encounter. And I think you have to really want to have casual sex for that risk to outweigh the benefit to you. So yes, there are women who are exceptions to this. There are also men who are exceptions to this. And I think it's worth emphasizing that male sexuality is quite flexible. Not in terms of sexual orientation. There's an interesting difference between the sexes, that women are much more likely to be bisexual than men are. 7% of men are straight. But they are flexible in terms of their short-term versus long-term strategy. So there are circumstances in which it's adaptive for men to want to have casual sex and to, in theory, men can conceive a child every time they orgasm, which is obviously not true for women because we have much greater physical input into reproduction. So you can see why women would have evolved to be much more choosy about their mates and much more careful about having sex than are men. And there is I describe it in the book as CAD mode. There's CAD mode for men is being driven towards being as promiscuous as you possibly can get away with, But the other mode for men, which I call dad mode, is orientated towards finding a wife, having children, investing in those children, investing in that unit, stability, there is. And there's an element of personal preference, as some men are just more likely to be drawn towards one mode or the other. But there's also an incentive factor and a culture factor that if it's advantageous in that moment for you to do one or the other, and if your culture is telling you to do one or the other, then that's going to drag men, in one or other direction. And I think what we see post-sexual revolution in our sexual culture is the incentives are all towards pad mode.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. I think a lot of that's how you're raised as well and who your friends are. And I think for me growing up, I went to an art school in high school, so I was in a very liberal crowd. I didn't even know like what a conservative person was until like 2016, really. Like I didn't know any conservatives. And there was definitely a stigma around getting married, settling down, even dating somebody for a long period of time. It was pretty intense. It was very difficult to find somebody who was interested in being married eventually. It did happen. Like I did have some friends that were like, "Oh no, I want to find somebody and settle down." And I think that was because of how they were raised. There was a big emphasis put on that's the right way to live. And for families that had a more difficult time or were somewhat broken, then there was less emphasis put on that. And then those are the people who still aren't married and are still kind of screwing around at like 32, which is also, which you probably get into, not that risky for a man, but very difficult if they're dating a 32-year-old woman who wants to have kids.
Completely.